The Road to Autonomy is presented by the Road to Autonomy Index. The Road to Autonomy Index is a rules-based equity benchmark index that measures the performance of a basket of global companies that are involved in the development and commercialization of autonomy. Institutional investors and fund managers are watching megatrends that are shaping investment opportunities today. These megatrends are creating thematic investment ideas and opportunities for forward-thinking investors. We believe that one of the biggest megatrends today is autonomy. That's why we created the Road to Autonomy Index, the world's first and only pure-play index to track the thematic investment opportunity in autonomy. Follow the Road to Autonomy Index on your favorite finance app by simply typing in the ticker Autonomy. To learn more about the Road to Autonomy Index, visit roadtoautonomy.com/index. Hello and welcome to the Road to Autonomy. I'm your host, Grayson Brulte. On today's episode, we're absolutely honored to welcome James Reed, COO Kodiak Robotics. James, welcome to the podcast.
It's great to be here, Grayson. Thanks for the invite.
It's great to have you here. You have an incredible finance background, which is important. We're going to get into that during this episode. But most important, you're CEO of Kodiak, and you're building a world-class business. You're brought on to build a business. You're building a business. Word on the street is that your revenue is outsurpassing everybody in the history of the autonomous vehicle and truck industries, and we'll get into that later. And if that's true, congratulations early on that. To kick things off, James, as I said earlier, you have the background in finance. What are your thoughts on the current state of the autonomous trucking industry?
I mean, look, that's a question we get asked a lot, Grayson, and it's a fair one. We try to focus our comments generally on Kodiak without talking a lot about our peers or the environment per se, but let me talk broadly about autonomy and about the rest of the industry. There have been some unfortunate closings of companies in the last 12 months, many of which have derived from technological challenges, some of which have derived from financial, just not raising enough money to make it to the finish line challenges. But the reality is, and we've heard this for really decades at this point, I mean, DARPA, next year, DARPA will have been 20 years ago. Finally, all of us that are on this path are at the point where autonomous vehicles are real, and driver-out autonomy in the trucking business is going to happen in the very near future. So that's kind of like the high level of where the state of the industry is. And we think the environment has really crystallized, and there's two people that really are making meaningful progress at this point in the Class 8 space, and Kodiak's at the top of that list.
20 years since DARPA. So the first DARPA was in Prim, and the second one, the Urban Challenge, was in Victorville. And you look at some of how the early stages of that technology, the Carnegie Mellon team, you have the Stanford team. The Stanford team obviously won the first one because they took a software approach, and then the Carnegie Mellon team took a hardware approach. It's really interesting to see how the technology has evolved from then. And you know this, it's gotten smaller. It's gotten scalable. You have those beautiful sensor pods. 20 years ago, it wouldn't be possible for you to develop the sensor pods and scale them the way you are today. With that in mind, how do you see the industry evolving over the next decades? Does it continue to mature? Do we have more financial discipline, or where do you see it going?
Let me start with the last part of your question. There's going to have to be financial discipline for this to turn into a real business for people. And that's one of the distinct advantages of Kodiak, frankly, is we have had a more austere approach to our funding, to our spending. And frankly, we've been more creative in how we leverage the external ecosystem. I mean, just as you said, this market has evolved. The capabilities have evolved. If you think of these things in an arc, we're really moving into the time of scalability. And as you think about what that means for Kodiak specifically, it means all the things we just said, right? We've got to continue to be disciplined. We've got to continue to leverage our partners in the ecosystem who are experts at what they do. We, for example, leverage our outside LiDAR vendors because we think they're the best at building LiDAR in the world. We're not going to do that. And so I just think maintaining that discipline, understanding that there's an arc to a development in the industry, and then leveraging that gives us a great opportunity to springboard to success in the future for sure.
As Kodiak grows, you raise future rounds, you look at future opportunities, and the culture grows, you hire more employees. How do you maintain that discipline?
I mean, I don't know how many of the listeners know this, but Kodiak has just around 200 employees today. And scaling that founder's mentality that Don Burnett and the founding team brought, it's a real challenge. But it's a challenge that all burgeoning organizations face. I was actually just talking to one of my team members this morning about this. There's this idea of the shadow of the leader, that by the actions of the leader, they create a perception about what's acceptable and what's expected in an organization. And Don's done a great job of persevering in what's acceptable and what's expected. And we have a very action-oriented, bias-for-action organization that's principle-led, that has a clear understanding of what our cultural values are. We had a planning meeting yesterday where we talked very little about what I'd call the gnat's eyelash issues and more about the principles that guide the business. And as you noted in your lead-in, I've worked at some massive organizations. I've led some really big organizations myself. And what you learn in scaling these companies is that principles matter. Don gets that, the team gets that. And so I think the guiding arc for the future will be that we'll be principle driven, and the principles that guide Kodiak are the right ones.
Principles, Ray Diallo, he built the whole brand on Principles, the book. He gives speeches. It's the whole Ray Diallo brand from Bridgewater. I've had the honor, and I've met with Don several times, had lunch with him a few times and spoken. And all the conversations, and really proud of him about this, it was all about the business. He doesn't get into the weeds of the nitty-gritty. He talks about the business and what that vision is and where Kodiak wants to go. You were CEO formerly of USA Truck. You did really well. You sold the company to DB Schenker. What was that like? What did you learn during that process, and what are you bringing to Kodiak? Because you had that successful exit. To me, it's that you're a really great mentor to Don because you have the experience from there. You have the experience from Washington Mutual, from T-Mobile. We could go down the line. Is that you bring this wealth of knowledge to what Don's doing at Kodiak?
First of all, it's really kind of you to say that. But Don, he's a humble guy. And when he first called me, he said, look, you have, and again, listeners may not know this, the first half of my career was in Silicon Valley. The second half of my career has really been in trucking and transportation. He recognized that I had something to offer in that regard. And so as we look to the future and like what's next for Kodiak, Don has, in fact, we had an all hands meeting yesterday where Don talked to everyone, including the engineering community, about the ultimate goal for this is a commercially successful company. And so I think it's maybe, I don't want to imply that engineers are monolithic because they're not. I was raised by an engineer, but the idea that this isn't just some cool tech. And in fact, I don't know if you've heard about this, Grayson. I did a presentation to our all hands, 6 or 8 months ago, where I talked about how the best product doesn't always win and showed examples throughout the history of technology where the best products didn't win. And so we do think we have the best product, but we understand that implementation matters, integration with the ecosystem matters, having the right customers, the right manufacturing capability, the right systems capability, that all matters. And Don uniquely has understood that from the beginning.
The ecosystem and partners matter. I'm going to go back to my passion, media. Remember the Beta VHS debates, where Beta was a superior product to VHS, but Sony vertically integrated. I was a Sony employee way back in the day, vertically integrated with the Beta, and then the VHS just took it over because the ecosystem and the partners. And we want to avoid that. We had the Blu-ray HDTV debate, and that was one for a different reason, which I won't say on air. We all know what that happened. So you've got this successful career. You successfully sold USA Truck. You have options. You could retire. You could enjoy the time on your farm. You could go in transportation. You could probably sit on the board of a couple publicly traded companies. Why join Kodiak when the world was your oyster at that point?
First of all, I learned pretty early on that I'm bad at retirement. A little bit personal. I'm only 51 years old. I feel like I've got a lot of gas left in the tank. And I was really wrestling with what do I do next? And what matters to me, and not to wax too philosophical, is how do I have the most impact on the most people? And when Don first came to me, first of all, I was a customer of Kodiak's, right? So at USA Truck, we were using Kodiak to explore our own ambitions with respect to autonomy, and Kodiak was by far the best partner. So I was a big fan to begin with. But I didn't tell Don yes immediately, and I've shared this with you, I think, before. I just woke up one day and realized if you got 100 smart people in the room, and you didn't time-bound the opportunity, but you said, will we have autonomous trucks in the U.S.? Every one of those intelligent people would say absolutely, without a doubt. And I think most people still hold that view. And because of that, I realized, oh my gosh, I have to be a part of this. It's an opportunity to save lives. It's an opportunity to improve the efficiency of the system. It's an opportunity to reduce costs for shippers and carriers, which ultimately translates to the consumer. And maybe somewhat paradoxically, but I'm glad to discuss this if we have time, I think it makes drivers' lives better. I went into transportation and trucking because I absolutely love the truck drivers. And there's a really solid argument that this makes their lives safer. It moves more of the jobs to the local and short haul variety of jobs. It allows us to control the supply chain more more effectively. So you have more consistent delivery, launching and landing of freight. And now these guys can go to their PTA meetings. They can go to their kids' soccer practice. Like it all benefits humanity. And I wanted to be a part of that.
They can be part of their local community. They can go to church on Sunday. They can be there for that little league game. And then I have this whole economic theory where autonomous trucks, what you mentioned, reduced costs, is going to lead to lower inflation. And then I start looking at these pockets of economic success where you traditionally have the over-the-road long-haul drivers, and perhaps they're going 100 miles, 200 miles, they're going home and at bed at night, and they're making more money. Think about that. They could invest in a hamburger or a hot dog stand, or they could invest in an ice cream parlor. They can invest in their local community and create jobs. Think about that positive economic impact that's going to have.
I had a professor in grad school, a guy named Hal Heaton, who spent most of his career at Harvard. I was not at Harvard, by the way. But he used to say, look, economic expansion is derived from increases in productivity. And as long as there's people, he used to say, as long as there are people digging ditches with shovels, we've got opportunities to improve productivity. And the economic equivalent of digging ditches with shovels in transportation is driving trucks with people in the specific applications where that's not the right answer.
And if you look at the very sad public statistics around health of the long-haul drivers and the health issues that they face and some of the unfortunate incidents that they face at rest stop, that's all going to go away. It's going to be good for the health of the community. There's so many positive benefits just outside the economics. Just the quality of life goes through the roof. You're messaging that and you're resonating that. But why are more of your peers in the autonomous trucking industry not resonating that positive message, in your opinion?
I'm glad you added the "in your opinion" part to that question. Honestly, I think it's lack of experience and exposure to the real vagaries of operating a company. I'm quite proud of the team that we've assembled at Kodiak. And, we won't go through the whole roster of accomplishments of the team that we have, but we have people here, myself included, who have run real companies that have real obligations to shareholders, that know how to manage revenue and manage expenses and understand what it really takes to operate. And I think when you have operators thinking about operational issues, which is really my job at Kodiak, is to make sure we have an ecosystem and environment that we can land this product in, so it's not the beta of the beta VHS discussion. By the way, the Reed household, this will tell you what kind of engineer my dad was. We had beta. I didn't have VHS until I was married, so that's a whole different thing. Look, I just think it's a different perspective born from different experiences, and that's okay. But we think that's a distinct competitive advantage here at Kodiak.
On the beta front, first movie I ever saw in beta, Lawrence of Arabia. Absolutely fantastic. First movie I ever saw in beta. And Peter O'Toole was an absolute genius. And Peter O'Toole had the acting experience that went on to a wonderful, wonderful career. And another contemporary of his, Alex Guinness, went on to another one. I'll go back in the way back when he did Bridge over the River Kwai. There was all these great movies when Hollywood actually made movies that mattered with exceptional actors. And that comes from really great experience. You have experience in, let's call it, unforeseen or unfortunate situations, especially during the 2008 financial crisis. I was living in New York City then, and boy, oh boy, did I experience that firsthand. My wife managed billions of dollars of real estate, and one of the apartments that they were leasing out was $45,000 a month then. And the gentleman from Lehman wanted, and their boss goes, no, he doesn't make enough money. It's all bonus. They can go away tomorrow. And sure enough, saw that firsthand what happens in that situation. During that time in 2008, you were division CFO at Washington Mutual, commonly referred to as WAMU, which eventually bought by JP Morgan Chase. What did you learn during that time, and did that make you a better, stronger business leader?
I was telling our team, you had asked me that the other day, and no one's ever asked me that question. It's a fascinating question. So at JP Morgan, or at WAMU, before we were JP Morgan, I was the divisional CFO supporting the chief marketing officer, Genevieve Smith, and also supporting WAMU.com. And at that time, WAMU.com was by far the leading technology solution for online banking in the world. It had the most deposits. It was growing the most quickly. I'm sure you remember this, Grayson. It used to take 30 to 40 minutes to an hour to open a bank account. And we revolutionized that. And we reduced the application time to 7 minutes, which at the time was unheard of. We were wildly successful. The retail bank was making $4 billion of net interest margin a quarter. But the mortgage side of the business was struggling and had bought into some subprime mortgages, and we had done some acquisitions. And so I learned about this dichotomy of you can be wildly successful and still fail as a team. I was a baseball player, and you could go 3 for 4 with a home run, and if the team lost, guess what? the team still lost. And I think this kind of circles back to what we were talking about in the beta VHS or any of the other wonderful Word versus Word Perfect. Like there's all these comparisons you can have across industry. It's not good enough to have the best product. You've got to have the best team. You've got to have the best strategy. You've got to have the best approach. And so as you think about how that influences my thinking at Kodiak, and hopefully Don's thinking at Kodiak as well, is we're really mindful of the importance of the full, people talk about the full human. I'll talk about the full company. Like you've got to have all sides of this. You can't just be a great engineering organization. You can't just be a great business organization. You've got to be all of those things. And that's probably the most meaningful thing I learned is the team matters a lot.
The pitcher goes 3 innings and gives up 5-6 runs. You're in trouble. You've got a big hole to come out of. And if you can make that hole was your mortgage business. What about risks management then? You had to obviously, you learned it at face value. What happens when one division could take down an entire corporation? Are you applying those risk management tactics of what you learned to Kodiak to avoid what happened with WAMU?
I guess the corollary for that would be kind of the safety case in autonomy. If we don't get the safety case right, and if we don't fully vet that case and have the right solution to the list of burn down issues that we identify, it could absolutely be a crater. And so one of the ways that you mitigate that risk is by getting the best people who have the most experience doing this. And we have on our team Steve Kenner, who is, you don't want to use the legend word too much, but the guy's a legend, right? And so we've built this team to mitigate risk on the transportation side and the autonomy side with Steve. From a information risk standpoint, we have Gerhardt, who's running, he's our CISO, and there's nobody on the planet that's a better CISO than Gerhardt. And so I think you mitigate those risks by having the right people. So yes, I mean, that experience has weighed into this. More specifically on like operationalizing the business, which is my key and main responsibility. We are going through this process today that we call operational readiness. It's just this idea of creating in the hypothetical, what are all the things that could go right or could go wrong, and what does steady state look like, and what are the variabilities around those steady states, and how do we plan for those, at least the known variables. And so on the operations side, we're doing all of this kind of what if testing on the business side, just as our engineers do in the development side. And it's really a comprehensive approach to mitigating risk. And that's what was missing, not just at WAMU, but Wells Fargo had the same issues. Anybody that was in the subprime lending space overextended their risk and didn't understand what the edge case potential impacts of that would be. And so, yeah, we look at that every day to make sure that we test these models at their extreme and don't take on more risk than would be healthy for the company and for the public.
Bottom line is, don't be countrywide. There's no other way to summarize it, but just don't be countrywide.
That's right. I mean, there are a number of companies that don't exist anymore. And what a great reference. Man, you're really digging deep here. That's a wonderful banking reference, by the way.
A personal story, a dear personal friend of mine was offered the chief marketing officer job back in, and Angelo invited him out, flew him and his wife out, and he said, okay, so we're going to give you a $5 million mansion, we're going to give you this Bentley and all this, and his wife goes, this is not normal. Well, you just don't get this. And then 6 months later, it blew up. So the moral of the story is that listen to your wife. They're very intelligent. They could tell you things.
Well, let me just say one more thing about that, though, because what you just described is the risk-reward curve. And as you mentioned it in your opening, I mean, I'm a classically trained finance guy. Like, that's where I grew up in business. And the risk-reward curve is an irrefutable law of physics. Like, where there are big rewards, there are also large risks. And so that example with your friend, it's the same thing in not just autonomous companies, but all technology companies. Our job is to mitigate that risk such that the returns become real. And that's really what we're about. We're about coming up with the best, safest case that mitigates as much risk as possible so that we can launch these companies and be sustainable in the future.
When you look to mitigate risk, I mean, I'm going to give you a Wall Street parlor game going on. The question is, where does Jerome Powell and the Fed go? Do we have soft landing, hard landing, recessionary environment? Glenn Youngkin, the governor of Virginia, came out and said that he sees a potential recession in 24 because the cost of groceries, which we're all unfortunately experiencing, the high inflation there. From a risk mitigation standpoint, how are you preparing the Kodiak business for this potential recessionary environment?
That's a fair question. I mean, I'm glad you didn't ask me what I think's going to happen. I know the Fed meets tomorrow. I know that November inflation came out today. It was 3.1%. So there seem to be some indications that the economy is doing better. That said, if we could predict interest rates, we'd be billionaires and we wouldn't be doing this podcast, would we, Grayson? But as you look ahead, I don't want to say it's the wrong question. I think it's a fair question. But the answer is, well-run companies plan for upsides, downsides, including recessions as part of their ongoing operations. So I don't know how the other autonomy companies are running their planning processes, but I can tell you at Kodiak, we have an extremely robust planning process. And in that planning process, we look at up cases, we look at down cases, we look at running the models, whether they be funding models, whether they be operational models, whether they be engineering models, you pick whatever it is. We push the models to their extreme to understand what happens if this goes way better than we think it's going to go, and what happens if it goes way worse than we think it's going to go. And that discipline and rigor and planning works in up cycles, down cycles, recessions, booms. It doesn't really matter. And so we've brought that discipline to bear here, and I'm really proud of what the team's done. I feel confident that our history of being really mindful with our resources, overlaid with the planning that we've put in place and the experience that we've brought to bear, puts us in as good a position as we can be. That doesn't mean we'll be protected from all scenarios, but we feel pretty good.
I would agree with that. The investors and bankers that I speak to are very bullish on your business, and then a lot of the information is public in the analyst reports. You look at businesses, and we're going to go, I'll give you another financial reference here because I geek out on that. When Mike Bloomberg was first starting Bloomberg, he ran the business always paranoid, thought they were going to go bankrupt every day, and then look what Bloomberg became and Mike became, because he had that mentality of every day is a survival day, and he built Bloomberg. This was pre-computer data days where they started digitizing everything. So you have the foundation for a very good business in Kodiak, and Wall Street's agreeing with you, your investors agreeing with you, several of the analysts that cover Kodiak in the private markets are agreeing with you. To those analysts and investors that are listening, James, what is the long-term outlook for the Kodiak business?
I mean, in a word, it's wonderful, but maybe to describe it more fully, one of the things that we've realized at Kodiak, and I hope I'm not getting too far ahead of you here, and some of this was serendipitous. Like if we were to go, you and I decide to go back to business school and they say, hey, write a case about building the right autonomous company, we would probably say, you probably don't want to rely on HD mapping because it doesn't give you the flexibility that you need in a perception stack. You probably want a modular sensor suite so that it's more operationally functional. You probably want flexibility that allows you to scale and be fungible and those things. And all of those things are true at Kodiak, but in honesty, I think they were somewhat serendipitous. I don't think they were the initial plan, like, hey, we've got this master mousetrap. I think it's just worked out in fabulous ways because of this principle that Clay Christensen talks about, which is the principle of adaptability. As you see opportunities, reevaluate where you are, and you tend to have these kind of happy accidents where you become more and more successful. Like AWS is a great example of that. That was never part of the business plan, but it's now by far the most profitable part of that business, right? So as you look to the future of Kodiak, we've got this fungible, scalable, flexible platform. We've got this huge trucking TAM that's close to $1 trillion in the US and $4 trillion worldwide. It's an enormous pool to play in, but it's still a little bit elusive, right? We still have to go through the safety case. We still have to get acceptance from the public. There's a lot of work yet to be done, all things that we can do. So about a year ago, we got into the defense space. And because of all the flexibility we have, we understood that we have a distinct competitive capability and advantage in unstructured spaces. And so working backwards, we realized, we can get quicker to revenue. We can ostensibly leverage the exact same stack that we have today in a different application and thereby accelerate the profitability of the company, accelerate the capability of the company, and still not be a distraction from the long-term Holy Grail. We've started thinking even more broadly recently about, gosh, we're so great at these unstructured environments. We're, again, leveraging the exact same platform and capability. Are there other places where this works? And so as we think about the future of Kodiak, I don't want to disclose too much about what our thought process is, but I'll just say this. We think we can get to revenue and therefore profitability quicker than anybody else. We think that we have the opportunity to scale through that thought process into what I call the holy grail of trucking, on par with everybody else. And because of that, I think the future of Kodiak looks extremely bright. It's a gigantic TAM. We only need very small fractions of the existing embedded trucking base to convert to autonomy for this company to be wildly profitable. The margins in a software company end up being pretty good, and therefore the long-term future of Kodiak looks amazing.
What you uncovered, if you want to use your term, that the happy accident with the unstructured environments could be your AWS moment. I was there when AWS was first announced for Hollywood, when they came out there, and it was the big thing. Oh, what's AWS doing? I'll never forget this. Netflix and PBS. And PBS Kids at that time was getting more traffic than Netflix on the AWS servers going way back there. And AWS, as we know, they've come a long way, in my opinion. That's the financial engine that keeps driving Amazon to where it is today, close to the $2 trillion market cap. Diversifying into DoD, the contract was awarded on December 5th. It's a $49.9 million, 24-month United States Department of Defense agreement to help automate future U.S. armed ground vehicles led by the Army's Robotic Command Vehicle Program. That's impressive. Does that turn into, let's say we talk 25 months from now, and then it's 149 million or 249 million, and now perhaps you're doing an AM General Humvee, or you're doing a tank because you can work in unstructured environments? Where do you see your DoD business going?
I don't want to say it's indisputable or irrefutable, but it's almost undeniable that Kodiak is better than anybody else in ramping up an unstructured autonomous capability. We've proven that recently with the Defense Department. Last week, we had a press release on this. The Secretary of Defense was visited with Kodiak. This week, we have another visitor coming, and the Deputy Secretary of Defense. We just have this incredible visibility with the highest levels of decision makers within the Defense Department because of the great capability that we've demonstrated. As you know, with the Defense Department, you really need to focus on, or at least our approach has been to focus on programs of record. Essentially, these are programs that are funded already in the budgetary process. All of this is public information, by the way. The Robotic Combat Vehicle, the RCV, which we were awarded, as you said, is in the developmental phases. And once it moves to production and then ultimately sustainable phases, I mean, these are 25, 30-year programs. I don't want to be so bold as to say how much we actually think the revenues will be, but these programs have revenues in the billions, right? And so as the autonomy provider on that platform, and we are really in the catbird seat to win this as the production partner, if we can maintain the lead that we have today, which this is totally in our control at this point, it stands to be a massive revenue opportunity just on the RCV program alone. Pursuant to your question, the next future programs, we're very aware of what those are. We're talking to all the right people. And the fact is today, if you were to, and you might have seen one of our trucks, it says that Kodiak is the autonomy provider to the U.S. Army. Like, we are the winner in that space today, and we intend to stay in that position. What does that mean for the future? I don't know, but it's a big number.
There was that great photo with Secretary Austin there behind the Kodiak truck. He said, I think it's an official partner of the United States Army. So you got that. I've been to West Point many times. So when's a truck going to roll into West Point? Is there going to be some point where it's going to greet the cadets at West Point? Are we going to get there at some point?
That's a great question. I'll talk to the marketing team and we'll figure out how to do that.
All right, deal. Next thing on that note, next year at Army Navy, we got to see the Kodiak truck at the Army Navy game. Now you're cooking.
You know what's really interesting? It would be cool to have one of those. In my last job, we used to wrap the trucks in military. It would be really cool to have an Army and a Navy truck, but we'll figure that out when the time comes.
You'll get there. Do you see Kodiak building a defense business over the long term? Will this be a key pillar of your strategic business operations?
Yeah, I think we've made the decision that while we are absolutely protective of our position as the leader in autonomy for Class 8 trucks, particularly commercial operations, that defense is going to be a pillar in our business going forward. It's something that we're committed to, and we're continuing to try to figure out how to play as a meaningful, and I don't use this term lightly, but in the funding mechanism that resulted in Kodiak being awarded, it was the first time that the physical platform and the software had been separated. And so while there's prime is a term to art, really, we intend to become a de facto prime in the autonomous software space.
You have the software, then I'm really curious, how much of a competitive advantage do your sensor pods give you for your DoD work? Is that a key competitive advantage that you have in DoD work?
One of the things that's incredible about our pods is the modularity and the extensibility of them, right? So we've published recently some marketing pieces, some video clips of our pods, form factor slightly adjusted, but the technology exactly the same, being put on a Ford F-150 that's been hardened for military use. It's the surrogate platform for what we're doing. It really demonstrates well, along with some of the things we've shown in the past. Of course, we have traditional Class 8 trucks. I think you've seen the press releases and the photos of the EV truck that we did. I mean, it's a key element of Kodiak's strategic thrust that we are platform agnostic. And this is just the most easily exemplified demonstration of that it truly is fungible between platforms.
Platform agnostic is scalable. I mean, go back into banking. Think about this. The ATM's a platform. You could put it in a mall. You could put it in a bank. You could put it in a convenience store. It's platform agnostic. It goes where the consumers need to get the money, and then the banks and the ATM tellers, they get their percentage fee there. It was a really good business. We actually use cash, and now it's all going digital with the MasterCard, Visa, and Amex dominating that market. How does Kodiak's defense business complement the autonomous trucking business? Are you learning from both businesses?
Without revealing too much about our most recent thoughts, moving into the defense space, we absolutely gained confidence about our ability to work in unstructured environments. I think it would be fair to say we're even better at it than we realized. Maybe you've heard the Kenny Rogers song where the boy throws the ball up and he misses 3 times and he goes, well, even I didn't know I could pitch like that. Even we didn't know that we were that great in unstructured environments. But it turns out it's something that our underlying architecture and modularity of our pods give us in spades. And so we've learned in this unstructured environment provided by the Department of Defense, and it has expanded our vision about what that might mean commercially.
How do you ensure that one side of your business doesn't outshine the other one, where there's not deprioritization and both businesses continue to thrive and move forward on their own unique individual timetables?
I don't know if my wife listens to your podcast, but she will kick me in the ribs for saying this. My Jedi skill is prioritization, and it is something that we, like all good companies, wrestle with regularly, Grayson. I don't have a great answer for that other than in the highest councils of our company, we have a disciplined, rigorous process to evaluate our prioritization and ensure that we make the right decisions about which businesses get which resources at which time. And that's a great question, by the way.
Are you running each business with their own P&L?
Interestingly, we have not decided to split the business, so we don't have an official defense division yet. But rest assured that when we are working with the Defense Department, we have a very clear understanding of what the financial cost of that business is. And when we make the decision to have a bona fide divisional split, I promise you we will have our own P&Ls and they will be managed as such.
Oh, good. Then we'll have you back on to deep dive into them at that point. I'm diving deeper into the revenue here because there's rumors circulating around, and I love your opinion, that Kodiak's generated more revenue than every other autonomous trucking and vehicle company combined to date. That's the rumor going around. It's a very good rumor. Is that true?
It's probably true. I have not personally gone to look at the public filings of everybody else and compare the financials. It wouldn't surprise me. I mean, you mentioned, let's round that 49.9 up to 50 million. The math's just a little bit easier, but $50 million of revenue coming from the Defense Department. We have more miles mapped, more loads run, more customers every single day on Kodiak, garnering revenue today, not for autonomy, but for freight operations. But yeah, it wouldn't surprise me at all if that math worked out.
Because you could look at a public filing, really simple one. Too Simple generated a little less than $1 million a quarter, just to give you an example there before their untimely and unfortunate situation. So you mentioned, so you're hauling freight today for customers and partners. Are those all revenue generating runs?
Yeah, we don't haul any freight for free. That said, the approach, and I think this is well understood, we go to our erstwhile potential customers, we develop a proof of concept with them, and really, and this is how I came to Kodiak in the first place as a consumer of this service at USA Truck. Those companies want to understand where autonomy is going to work for them, how it's going to work for them, what kind of operational changes and integrations they have to do. And again, this is kind of going back to one of your earlier questions. I mean, we just have a distinct and unique operational capability at Kodiak that I'm confident nobody else has. As we sit with these guys, we get incredible feedback. I mean, we go through value stream mapping of all their processes. We do process mapping of all the processes, obviously. We identify, and this is a key distinguishing factor in how we interact with our customers. We try to help them figure out how Kodiak can work in their system, not how their system works within Kodiak. We are a very customer-focused organization. And so as we do that, we've found great reception on the other side of this. And in fact, we've been able to integrate our TMS system with one very large customer recently. I don't think anybody else has done that. So we're really taking an operational mindset to it that will bode well for the future.
Because some of the partnerships you've announced this year with CR England, Tyson Foods, and Marischek, will that partnership trend continue as we go into 2024?
We have already signed some other really meaningful customer interactions, and you can just imagine they're only going to get bigger and bigger. And those are some pretty high-profile companies. So I think the listeners could fill in the blanks for who would the next potential suspects or prospects be, and you'd be right. Some of those are really big companies that, for their own reasons, maybe don't want to publicize that, and so you'll never hear about it. But we do have some really good announcements coming in the very near future.
Those companies, let's call them Acme, for example, might not want to go public. It's going to help your revenue. You're going to generate revenue from, so it's going to help Kodiak.
The way I look at it, and I'm just going to be really blunt about this, is we're still a venture-funded early stage company. And so even though we're very kind of Spartan with our resources, we wrap dollar bills around every mile we run today. We're not making money moving freight. It's too inefficient as we're continuing to develop our software capability to actually make money at it. And so rather than work with everybody, I kind of think of it as a waterfront. We're trying to work with a big retailer. We're trying to work with a big team-driven organization. We're trying to work with a big dedicated organization. We're trying to work with some LTLs. Like, we're building this waterfront of properties, but we don't need all the properties. And so we're very cautious about who we work with, but we also want to work with as many people as we can to seed the market such that when we are ready to commercialize, we've got an embedded base that's convertible quite quickly.
You can look at this, it's a brand building exercise outside of the revenue, and it's a trust building relationship where you're building the Kodiak brand in the market, you're building those trusts with those partners and eventually potential customers. And going back to the revenue, has Kodiak always prioritized revenue? Was that always one of Don's early initiatives that we have to generate revenue in order to be a successful business?
I try not to use superlatives, so I don't know if always is fair. I would guess, and this is kind of hearkening back to one of your earlier questions, Don has always understood, and maybe his foundation story is important for people to understand. He was at Carnegie Mellon. He was one of the founding engineers at Waymo. He really felt like trucking was the use case that mattered and got away from robotaxi, and he started Auto, sold out Auto to Uber, was the technical lead at Uber ATG. They decided to focus on robotaxis. He said, no, I really believe that trucks are the answer. And then he started Kodiak. And so I think there's a really consistent thread in there that Don has always had a commercial motivation to the ultimate kind of hearkening of the company. But in the early days, I think most startups are a technology play, like, let's go, this is really cool, let's go do this. So to say that it was always about revenue, I wasn't around, I can't definitively say. I can say this, in the last year and a half that I've been here, it's been an understanding that long-term revenue opportunities will be critically important, and it's important to investors. And let's just be blunt about it. What investors are concerned about is these long-term promises of Class 8 trucks, commercial operations, getting revenue. What's that timeline? It's a little bit uncertain. You can't ever tell me. And that becomes uninvestable for people. What they really want to know is, when will you get paid for autonomous miles? And our goal is to get paid for autonomous miles in 2024 via some of the means that you and I talked about. So bring that assurance, that certainty forward and going, oh my gosh, you're actually getting paid to have driver out autonomy is a big, 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 big deal. So yes, it's been our focus, at least recently. And I think Don's understood it from the beginning.
So you have some other autonomous trucking companies that have no revenue, that's public documents, and others that have little to none that are private companies. There's not a document that I can reference with you. So let's just say you're sitting down with an investor or investors, and they're saying, oh, well, so-and-so's doing this and so-and-so's doing that. Do you just open up the briefcase and say, listen, here's this Excel spreadsheet, here's the revenue we're generating, let the revenue talk for itself? Is that your big moment there?
Not quite. I'll just go back to what I just said. I think what people really want to know is, when will you get paid for driver out autonomy? And the more certainty we can bring to that discussion, the more likely people are to put their investable dollars behind that. And so we think we have a great story with the defense and how we look at unstructured environments as a potential upside for us.
And I'll say this, from knowing you personally and Don and Andy and a lot of your leadership team, it's an extremely well-managed company, and investors like to invest in management teams as well. They want to invest in people that they trust that's going to make their money earn more money. Or as I say to my daughter, you want your money to make more friends. And that's what the investors want, the same thing as well. We're headed into 24. You're going into your second year as COO. What are you hoping to achieve with the Kodiak business in 24?
So we just talked about this internally. We haven't rolled out to our entire employee base what 2024 goals and objectives will be. And so I'm not going to roll that out on your podcast. But I will say generally, we will continue to focus on the engineering and technical milestones that we need to get to deliver driver-out autonomy. I mean, 2024 is the year that we expect to demonstrate that for real for the first time. So we're really excited about that. I think the second thing that we'll focus on is just continued commercialization. It's what we just talked about. And that takes a couple of forms. It's building this portfolio of potential customers and industry partners, which we have been extremely successful at, and we expect to do the same. But it's also the operational readiness that I talked about earlier. I mean, as we move towards driver out on public roads, we need to have a full contingency plan operationally to be able to handle that. And paradoxically, it's a little bit weird. You actually have to be more capable operationally early on than you do in the later part of the cycle, because more things, I don't want to say can go wrong, but more unplanned events can occur, and you've got to be prepared for that operationally. So I think operationally in 2024, we've got to be more ready than we've ever been to run a real business in a really amplified microscope environment. So we're pretty excited about what the future holds. And then, of course, we want to continue to make progress in the defense business.
Looking past 24, what's the future of Kodiak, in your opinion? At some point, you become profitable. Do you become standalone? Do you become part of a larger organization? What is the future?
I think the plan of the founding engineers, including Don, has always been to ultimately have a payday for those original investors, the venture folks that have been so involved and so critical to Kodiak's success. And so there would be an IPO in the future that would be a great liquidity event for those people. That said, you can't predict those things. You can't put them on a calendar and say, we're going to do this on this date. I mean, I've been a public company CEO. I've lived with the uncertainty of those financial calendars. And so I think our job is just to be the absolute best operationally executed company in this space with the best tech, and the rest will kind of take care of itself. Does that mean a strategic comes in the future? I mean, it could. I mean, we never intended to sell USA Truck, but a strategic came at the right moment and said the right thing. And so you want to be cautious about predicting the future. But I think the plan would be to have a liquidity event that pays back these wonderful early stage investors who took the bets early on in what we think is the best company in autonomy.
Well-run companies that are extremely well-managed have a lot of potential outcomes. If you give you an example here, ABC Capital City is one of the most historically well-run companies, and we saw the successful exit that they had to the Walt Disney Company, and that's what put Iger in charge at Disney. And there's other cases we can go down the line of companies that are extremely well-managed. When you're an extremely well-managed company, you have options, is the bottom line. James, this has been insightful. I've enjoyed the beta, the VHS, the finance geeking out. As we look to wrap up this insightful conversation, what would you like our listeners to take away with them today?
Well, thanks again for having me on your show. It's great to see you, and it's great to hear these questions. Nobody's ever asked me about how WAMU impacts what we do at Kodiak, so I think hopefully that's a really useful perspective for your audience. I think the thing to remember is the thing that I learned when I first came to Kodiak, which is the future is now. Autonomy has been talked about for a very long time, and it's taken a long time to work through the technical challenges. The ecosystem, the physical capability of hardware systems was not there. It's here now. It really works. And so I think the takeaway for people is the promises of the past are behind us. 2024 is the year that we expect to have a driver out. And beyond that, just the ability to manage and ramp a commercial roadmap that will pick the winners and losers. And we think Kodiak's the winner.
James, you said so eloquently. The future is now. Autonomous trucks are real. Autonomous trucks are scaling. The future is bright. The future is autonomous. The future is Kodiak Robotics. James, thank you so much for coming on the road to autonomy today.
Thanks, Grayson.
If you've enjoyed listening, please kindly rate, review, and subscribe on your favorite podcast platform. Want to get in touch? Follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube at Road to Autonomy, or email podcast@roadtoautonomy.com. The Road to Autonomy podcast is produced by the Road to Autonomy LLC. The views and opinions expressed in the Road to Autonomy podcast do not necessarily reflect those views of the Road to Autonomy, its subsidiaries, its shareholders, directors, investors, or partners. The content discussed on this podcast is for informational purposes only. It should not be taken as legal, investment, tax, or business advice. Nothing is a recommendation that you purchase, sell, or hold any security or other investment, or that you pursue any investment style or strategy. The content of this podcast is presented on an as-is basis with no warranties, express or implied, of any kind. Financial mentions about companies in the Road to Autonomy Index and discussions about the Road to Autonomy Indexes are for informational purposes only and should not be relied upon when making any investment decision. Furthermore, an inclusion of security within the Road to Autonomy Index is not a recommendation by the Road to Autonomy Indices, LLC, to buy, sell, or hold that such security, nor is it considered to be investment advice.